welcome of our own in-breath, the natural surrender of each out-breath. We start in gratitude that we are here together. We've been brought to the path of all the learning and the stumblings, the liberation, the healing and the wisdom that has birthed itself so far. And as we greet this moment in reverence, let us remember what is breathing us, what is bringing forth the questions we grapple with, and the grace that responds and emerges as we listen. So let us listen together. And as we listen for everyone. We listen for the human family. We listen for the highest possibilities. And we offer it all back with love.
Those were the beautiful words and the prayer of our guest today, Miranda Macpherson. Miranda is an interfaith minister, a spiritual teacher, an author, has many roles, and currently leads the Living Grace Global Sangha, quite an organization and quite a international community. She's also the author of a number of books. My favorite, The Way of Grace, The Transforming Power of Ego Relaxation. And she's also written Boundless Love and Meditations on Boundless Love. And Miranda is also a beautiful musician, wonderful singer. And I've just been very touched by her work and her music. And so, Miranda, it's a gift to have you with us today, and you're one of the few people we've had back. So
I'm very honored. It's a great privilege.
well, it's actually our delight. You know, as I was reflecting on what to explore with you, there's so much, but you know, as I reflected, I was really struck by your spiritual biography, because you have a very remarkable story. In some ways, you're a child of our time, having explored so many of the world's traditions, not only studied them, but practiced in them. But you started your spiritual life in a most remarkable way. As I understand, your first real opening was as an early teenager when you were depressed.
Yeah.
You know, I've treated a lot of depressed people. I've never seen anyone have the kind of opening you describe. This is fascinating. Would you be open
Yeah,
to saying more about that?
sure, I'd be happy to. Um, you know, I'm often asked, what brought you to the spiritual path? And we're all brought to the spiritual path, usually because we're on our knees in some way. We're suffering in some way. So my answer, the simple version is, well, I was suffering. Only I was aware I was suffering, which is kind of interesting. I remember being a kid and seeing things that did not make sense to me. Like, it did not make sense to me when people were mean or unkind to one another. It hurt my heart, and I'm like, why? It, something in me knew this is not natural. And whether that was happening within my family, within my peers, or just as I looked out upon this world that, when we're children, we're presented with this is the world and this is how you be in it, and here are some modeling and examples. And everything that I was shown, something in my heart was just saying, this cannot be it. It's like I jokingly call it my John McEnroe kind of tantrum. You cannot be serious. So I think at the core of my young depression was a spiritual kind of tussling, with the umpire, who I didn't kind of like. This, you cannot be serious. This, you cannot ask me to say yes to this. This doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
Um, and yet, my own conditioning and so forth, there was no space to speak any of this, and perhaps I didn't even have the language anyway, or I didn't feel safe enough, or I didn't trust, and probably all of the above. But my response, I remember it getting to a certain threshold, a tipping point, and something in me just says, I'm not playing. And my defense or response to that feeling like it was too much, the meaninglessness, the lack of love and kindness, the things that didn't make sense and that hurt, my response was to withdraw into myself. And I really just wanted to disappear. And eventually, that led to being noticed that this young girl wasn't doing so well. And I was hospitalized. I was given the choice, a teenage psych unit or an adult one. And I said adult. That was my choice.
Big league.
It's an interesting thing there. And I think that it's part of the awakening, because it speaks to something in me was not interested in playing games with being here. I was really grappling deeply without any support or container or navigation with what is life, what makes sense, what's how can we really be here in this human realm in a way that is meaningful and noble and beautiful and good. And nothing that I had been presented with really was satisfying. And so I remember, being pretty stubborn in my position in all of this. And thankfully, I was never medicated. God bless my mother, who was a nurse, who insisted I was not medicated. No one really knew what was going on with me. And I remember just being so withdrawn. I was lying on my bed one day and I was looking out at the plants that were just there outside my window. And I start to pray to a God I didn't know I believed in. As I said, I did not come from a religious family, so no one had put pressure on me to accept a view of God, and this is how you have to think and feel about it. Um, but I remember praying, and my prayer wasn't a very sacred prayer. It was a prayer of resistance. Beam me up. I'm done here. Only I think I exhausted myself in my own resistance, and something broke through in my heart, and it felt like an explosion from within, an explosion into absolute, indescribable, boundless love and truth. And it was like being plugged into the mains. And all of my questions were completely answered. And in that experience, I knew this is meaningful. This is more real than anything. This is the truth of who you are, who I am, who everything and everyone really is. And the purpose of life is to live this somehow, to live from this depth that is good and true and loving and makes sense.
Mhm.
And of course, simultaneously, as you know, the great yogis of the East taught us, this is ananda. So it's simultaneously joy and bliss as well as love. It's not just love, and it's not just an interpersonal love. It's the very source of all of the love that we feel, of all of the joy that we feel. And it is is just like this unstoppable river of nectar that has no top, bottom, middle, side, beginning, or end.
Mm.
And so the impact of that on this 13-year-old girl was all of a sudden she was all right to be here. It felt like, okay, I can be here. Okay. I had the meaning. I had something that was true and it was profound, and there was nothing that could ever convince me of anything other than this. So, this profound experience of the grace of boundless love woke me up, put me on the path, showed me the direction, gave me the strength to go back into the life where there was a lot of difficulty. There was difficulty in my household, there was difficulty at school. It was not an easy time. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that the circumstances of my life were harder after that awakening than before it. But the difference was I knew absolutely unrefutably that, I would get through this, I could get through this. There was a meaning and a direction that was what was so. So it gave me optimism, courage, strength, joy, tenacity, and a deep devotion to find out more about all of this that had come online. And yeah, that's what put me on the path.
Beautiful. I think you've answered the question that was at the back of my mind, which I alluded to when I asked the question, which was, I've seen so many people who are depressed, and I've never seen anyone have this kind of opening. And I think you pointed to some of the unique features, which was curiously, it sounds like you were suffering an existential despair
Yeah.
in your teens instead of in your 30s, 40s, and 50s, as
Yeah.
most people do.
Right. And
You
I
were
felt
precocious.
profoundly, I was totally precocious. And I think actually I feel so grateful that that happened, even though, boy, it was hard. Because you know how we go through big things, and every human being goes through big things that are edgy, that from a shamanic perspective might be called a shamanic initiation, that take us a little further than our edge, and there's an opportunity in that edgy space to, for something to die and something new to wake up. And I just feel that that was divine grace saying, let's get this girl on the path. Let's save time. She's got some work to do, and let's just speed it up here. Because in that fire, I got to be very close to all sorts of other forms of existential human crises and suffering. I got to be in a room with people who had slit their wrists the night before and were just wheeled in from emergency now to have psychiatric treatment. I got to be up close and personal as a teenager with schizophrenic outbursts, with people in despair, with people coming off, drug and narcotic addiction. And I was hanging out with them, going for walks with these people, being with them in my suffering, in these fragile states that we were all in. And I am not afraid of those places. I feel so fortunate to have had direct encounters at such a formative age with all these different forms of human, spiritual, psychological suffering, and what a soul is grappling with. The things that they don't feel they have the strength or the capacity to face, or the things that have happened to them that have been too much, and no one knowing how to ask the questions, how to be with you, and just hold your hand and just be there, and in the right moment, waiting for the right moment to just say something so homeopathic like, what's too much? Or
Mm.
what hurts? Or what do you feel? And I know from my own experience that often in those places there aren't words. You don't have the words, but you're feeling it. And I don't know, I'm probably sure I wouldn't know, I wouldn't have the capacities that I actually do to be with people very deeply on a soul level in these super important crucibles where spiritual and human is kind of crunching together in some very important way that I regard as a holy juncture.
Mm,
I really do. So I don't look at things with those clinical terms because my own experience says perhaps it's not. Perhaps there's more going on.
yeah.
We're,
Yeah, let me reflect too. I had my first opening when I was, I don't know, 11 or 12 years old,
oh,
pre-adolescent.
wow.
But it was the same. I think the questions you were asking were very noble questions. You know, like what the F, God? You
Yeah.
know, you know, I'm like, what is up? You know, and I was hurt. I was angry. I had one brother who was an infantryman in Vietnam, got wounded 3 different times. Was right in the middle of it. I think he was like 18 years old, 19, oldest. And I had one brother run off, my other brother, both older, run off to be a hippie in Haight-Ashbury in New York and traveled the country, did he? And I was left alone and I didn't get it. You know, my parents were very Republican, conservative, not like Republicans today, but you
Yeah, I
remember
get it. There's a big
right back
difference.
then. And I was lost, and I had this big opening. One thing I didn't find, and I wanted to ask you, when you had this opening as a young woman, and you asked the right questions. The story of Parsifal has been a big part of my life, and teaching and sharing. And he, as a young man, he finds the Grail Castle, and then he loses the vision because he didn't ask the right questions.
Ah,
You know,
mm.
and it seems like you were asking the right questions. And after this opening, this awakening, did you find mentors to help you to understand
Yeah.
what's going on? Because I didn't for many
Yeah, I
years.
didn't for many years either. But you know what? One of the things I've learned about grace, when it arrives, is that it always brings what's needed. And that's part of the mystery and the miraculous nature of it. And part of a, like a bit of direction that came spontaneously somehow with the opening into boundless love was don't speak to anybody about this till you're an adult.
Mm,
And I'm very glad for that little piece of nugget because had I spoken to anybody about this, I probably wouldn't have been discharged a week later, for starters. And secondly, I knew they would not have understood it and it would have been judged or dismissed or ridiculed or not met with what was needed. And it was too precious to me to risk that. So I didn't find any people that I could speak to about this until I'd left my family home when I was about
Did you talk
17.
to your friends about it? I mean,
Not
you're
nobody, nobody,
okay.
nobody. And then, as soon as I was old enough to start looking, I found I was growing up in Perth, Western Australia, which is like 20 years behind everywhere else. Roger would have some sense of that, being from a different part of Australia. But Western Australia is even further away from the rest of Australia, so it's kind of behind what it was when I was growing up there. So the only two things in town were the Osho Rajneesh bunch, and I was too shy, and the whole sexuality of all of that was way too overwhelming for me to get too close to it as a young girl. And then there was the Theosophical Society, and that was more comfortable. So I could walk into this, I still remember it very vividly, this house, with all these dusty bookshelves, and I'm gravitating to, I mean, it's all grace, really. I'm gravitating to first thing I pull off the shelf Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Ananda Mayima, Yogananda, all the Eastern sages. And, then I picked up a bit of Gurdjieff and Blavatsky and Seth Speaks. And, that's what I was reading and getting into. And also, I happened upon Jerry Jampolsky's Love is Letting Go of Fear, which was beautiful because I remember reading that on my bed as a teenager and just putting it down every now and again. And it's starting to help me remember some of the implications of this love and to to let that help me open my mind and my heart to the things in my family structure and the behaviors that I didn't like and found really painful and difficult. Um, but it was really when I left my family home and I found a yoga teacher who happened to just, again, it's all grace. I found a real teacher who was amazing, and he only took 8 students at a time in a class. And he was a direct disciple of Iyengar, and he was very strict, and we got adjusted in every pose, and he could tell what was going on with you all. I mean, I still hear his voice anytime I do any hatha yoga, and I remember him coming and tapping my toe and reminding me, Miranda, this is not gymnastics, this is yoga. There's no awareness in your toe. You're not present. And every class ended with pranayama.
Mm.
And it was amazing. It started to iron me out because I had a lot of trauma, as you can imagine, and a lot of material I had to work through, conflicts and suffering and trauma and just wounding that, most of us have from our childhood. I certainly had plenty of that. And I was very aware this needed to be addressed, that just because I had tasted this reality didn't mean I was capable of living it. A long shot off. And I knew
Yeah.
that. So I knew, okay, we need to get to work here. And I was motivated because as a young adult, I was starting to see things about what was coming out of me in my interpersonal relationships, insecurities, judgments, self-hatred, that tough, crunchy material, that we have to, what I call the meat sauce of the lasagna, that we have to deal with, that we have to tackle in
Mm.
ourselves. And I went for it in my 20s. I was very aware of all of that and what works, what do I need?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you are definitely a person of the times, having explored so many traditions. You know, I want to go back to that opening for a moment because you made sense of it for me, and I think for for all of us, in as much as this was not a typical teenage depression. This was really an existential crisis. But as I say that, I'm thinking, well, there's probably an element of existential crisis to many teenage
I
depressions.
think
I think
so. And
we've got,
especially for people now. I
yeah,
mean, God bless the young people. My goodness, like that was me in the mid early 80s. Like, how much harder must it be to be, that age now in this time, with climate change and all things Trump and the discord and the misinformation and AI, the people that developed it didn't think to build ethical codes right into the foundation of it from the get-go. And who knows, social media. I mean, just it's so much harder now.
Yeah.
So I just feel, people like us right here and now, we have a absolute need to help in whatever way we can, help the generations after us, make it a little easier because they're going to have it harder in some ways. And
I
yet,
think that's a great point. It's harder now. There's more stuff, you
mm,
know, just all in our face. And, it was hard enough. I was growing up in the 60s and there's a lot of stuff going on, but it wasn't like it is today.
right.
And um, I, I grew up Catholic and it never dawned on me to go to a priest because I didn't think they would understand what had happened.
Yeah, right.
In a very Christ-centric kind of thing. I was reading New Testament or the Gospels anyway. And uh, finally, when I guess I was mid to late teens, I found an autobiography, not an autobiography, biography of St. Francis of Assisi.
Oh,
And I went,
lovely.
oh, I could have talked to this guy, you know, he would, yes, he was my brother or something. I would have understood that. And that was a very pivotal point that I realized I wasn't completely crazy, that there was some kind of historical basis on people that had touched into to God. Let's just use the G word for it because that's what it
I'm
felt like.
all for using the G word.
the big G.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, really, we all mean different things, and I think we all need to listen to what is the authentic language of our own soul. But I know that for myself, when I hear the word God spoken of from the heart, from our sincerity, it's ecstatic. It just brings alive what is noble and pure and real, and the place in our hearts where we know that. Like what you're describing, John, like the teenage self, you encountered St. Francis and like your heart goes, yes, yes, I know this. And so it's speaking to the parts of us that maybe haven't had the support or the articulation or the mirroring or haven't yet happened upon it. But, like it says in the Course in Miracles, Roger, that you and I know and love dearly, that passage is one of my favorites where it speaks about the forgotten song. And it says, listen, perhaps you catch a hint of an ancient state, not quite fully remembered, but like a song. The full melody you don't remember in its entirety, but just a little wisp of the melody, attached not to a person or a place or anything in particular. But as you listen to this melody, it brings alive, awakens the memory of what you love, of what you are, of that which is more dear to you than anything in this world. And then it goes on to say, listen, you know, just it invites you to listen. And then it speaks about the fear that we all have of remembering the whole song, because and the conflict that inevitably brings up in us of the fear of loss, the fear of loss of what we know, of what we think we are, of all of our attachments and misunderstandings that is our familiar way of navigating the world, and the cost of remembering the whole song and living it fully is the willingness to just say, thy will be done. Like if I disappear, okay, right? And at a certain point, I kind of see all spiritual practice is just to build up enough musculature to nurture that inner knowing in there that's always there in the deep heart, to nurture it by paying attention, by letting ourselves feel the fact that we love it, that it does represent what is deeper and more meaningful and more noble and more real and more precious and more joyful, and that there's guidance in that knowing, and that, as we nurture it through some kind of practice, and listen to what nurtures it for us, and it's unique in each being, then ultimately it asks us for a full surrender, and then a fuller surrender still, until there's no one left to care what happens. And then there's only God.
Mm.
Only God. Right? And then, well, how does God want to be here now? How does God want to show up? How does God want to contribute? How does God want to love? How does God want to listen? How does God want to act? What does God want to create that births beauty and truth and goodness? And because I don't know about you, but in my experience, there's nothing else to do here that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and, and that statement, just what you just said, um, yes, from the perspective of of openings such as you've had, it makes total sense, and it's also, unfortunately, a rare perspective in our world, and may it become less rare. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
uh,
And that's what wakes me up every morning, because I've had a pretty intense life. It's been edgy, very edgy in many places, but it's often in these edgiest places that the biggest openings to another level and another possibility have become known, and then there's been a process of learning how to adapt to that new opening that feels like having no skin at all for a while.
Mhm.
And then I always go, what happens in my heart is always an innate knowing where I feel such a deep wanting this for everyone. It's
Mhm.
such this sense of being so blessed and so fortunate to have had this open. And I know it's not just for me, it's for all of us, it's for all the precious children of humanity and all the ones who will ever come. And so I then go, my mind comes in with a curiosity to what's the magic little key? And I backtrack over my own experience to go, is there anything that I did that might have helped that to happen?
Yeah.
Is there any practice? Is there any activity? Is there any emphasis in what I was chewing on, right? In any way that was in some way supportive for that to happen? And I've seen, yes, there often is, right? And then there's a whole part of it that's just grace itself. And we could
Yeah.
talk about that, but because it is a dance of, engagement, sincere engagement with practices and curiosity and interest and study. And then, that's priming the pump, and then grace takes over. But then we have to integrate, we have to understand what did that mean? Like for every a realization that has happened here in this location, I have had to go, what is the meaning of this? What is its wisdom? And how can that be lived in all the little areas of life? How can this be expressed and embodied in the deepest, most beautiful way so that the only impact this has is a blessing for others?
Right. Given this, how can I serve?
Yeah, but if we take the I out of it,
Yeah. Okay.
there's your answer.
Uh, Beautiful. And, and Miranda, you've just synopsized three key phases in spiritual life. One is looking at how do we play, quotes, our role in this? How do we facilitate the openings that you're describing? Second, and then the openings themselves, and then third, the process, which is often given short change, which is the major process of integration.
Yeah. But I think for me, I'm looking at it not only for myself, but for others.
Yeah.
Because it's also, I know, no, absolutely that, when things open in me, it's not just for my benefit, it's for everyone's benefit. And that by whatever, mystery, I happen to be a spiritual teacher. Since my 20s, people have been coming to me asking for help in their process. I didn't intend, that wasn't a career choice. It just, one thing led to another, and people came and teachers asked me to do this, and okay, here we go. One thing led to another, and this is the path. This is what my function is. And it's a great blessing, and it's very challenging. But if I just sit with, I look at what's going on in the body of the people that come to me, and I let myself see them, feel them, take in what they're grappling with, what isn't yet clear, what isn't yet available to them. And I'm interested in the intersection of what's available to me and what are they struggling with, and what's the intersection, what's the magic little three-part inquiry that is going to like open up that little door that's blocked. What's going to clean the window pane a little bit, clarify the confusion? What's going to soothe the suffering? What's going to help the system relax so it's more receptive? And, I've seen and learned so much. I mean, there's a whole body of practices and teachings and different kinds of practices, some of them inquiry practices and very specific, some of them devotional practices, ancient and contemporary, um, some of them meditation practice, some of them classical meditations, and often I'm just given meditation practices. It just pours through, and it's in response to that question that I'm sitting with is, well, how can more of us? How can this be replicated? How can the children of humanity grow up, clean up, wake up, show up, as Ken Wilber so perfectly synthesized?
And if
Yeah.
you found more, there's some writers who think that in our times, historically, more people are waking up than in the past. Do you find that the pressure of present times and the people that you work with and what you've seen, that people are beginning to wake up on more
You
in
know,
greater percentages?
well, I think it's both end because I I'm also someone who at this time in my life I pay more attention to what's going on in the world than I ever have. And I regard watching and listening to the news as a spiritual practice these days of staying grounded in my body and opening my heart and seeing all of the distortion, the ignorance, and the conflict as humanity's prayer list, as the collective cleanup that we still have yet to do. And let's face it, there's rather a lot of that right now.
Yeah.
And then I also see people of all different ages and stages of life, like coming towards these teachings and loving it and having a wonderful time and taking joy in the process of decompressing out of date ways of being that are clunky and dense and don't work very well and never did, and are interested to see what's possible. Who are we really? And what's possible for me? What's possible for us? And forming relationship with one another, becoming mighty companions to one another. So I don't really know, to answer your question, John, because I think I see both equally. And it just brings me back to the now. And, you know, how can I be with it all? How can I nurture, the awakening of the others? How can I continue the clean up and the growing up and the showing up in myself? Because I do see that it continues. It's not that we've cleaned up and then we move on and then we've grown up. No, well, there's more. There's always more evolution and openness and clarification and expansion and possibility because God is exponential.
Mm.
Yes, I'm not willing to bet on much in this life and this game, but one of them is there's a lot more to it than I understand. So,
If there's one thing that helps me more than anything, it's that lesson we both know and love in the Course of Miracles, Roger. I do not know what anything is for.
hmm,
And so I was sharing with my students the other day in a teaching I gave called Trusting the Mystery. And I was saying to them, and I really do feel this, that although, you know, I want humanity to wake up, I want this to be that we're in the birth canal to a higher possibility collectively. The truth of the matter is, I don't really know. I hope so. I might be wrong. There's a lot of evidence right now that that is wrong. We don't know. I do not know what anything's for. And that's not going to stop me showing up every morning in prayer. What's possible and what little part can I play in bringing forth what serves? And although I don't know whether, human beings are going to be able to wake up, clean up, grow up, show up quickly enough for human life to be able to continue, that doesn't mean I'm going to stop doing what I can and being meticulous and looking at the choices that I'm making and how I live and the influence I have on others and, doing what we can to be more impeccable in those choices and caring for our impact as we go along. So it's the both end.
uh, beautifully said. And yes, given these extraordinary times in which there are unprecedented threats to our civilization and even our species and the planet, of course, there's a spectrum of attitudes people take from the doomers and collapsitarians to the techno utopians, and despair. But I think you pointed to something that's really important, that we don't know how it's going to turn out, but the question that we're left with is basically, what can I do?
Exactly. And right in the now, because, despair, optimism, it's all past future, isn't it? And within that there is presumption that we know
Yeah,
everything there is to know, and that's just simply not true.
yeah.
And so I rest in that lesson. I do not know what anything is truly for. It always brings me rest, refuge, and it brings me right back to humility in the now.
Mhm.
And what I know from experience is that is the posture of receptivity to exponential grace. Only when I'm willing to empty out of all my thoughts and opinions and presumptions, even if they're very informed ones, and I am willing to just open into the mystery of I don't know what anything is for. I don't even know what a hand is for. If you really go down into it, whatever the situation is, I don't know what it's for. It might be for a lot more than I think, or I can even imagine or conceive. And so if I use that to help me be here now in all of it, the beauty and the horror and the things that are hard to bear and the hopes that we have that may or may not come to fruition. And I remember something deeper is in charge and has been in charge this whole time and
Yeah.
knows what it's up to.
Yeah.
Then my job is to align with that, say yes to that, open to that, let that lead.
Yeah. And uh, there's a your life has gone through a number of phases to bring you to this point. And we began with talking about the remarkable opening you had in your early teens, but and you've done a lot of practice. There have been a lot of experiences, and you've you've worked hard. And um, the other side of the work is, as you emphasize, the grace. And you had another really life changing and life orienting experience in Ramana Maharshi's cave, and quite a different quality from your earlier experience. Well,
Yeah, completely different.
Roger and our team would like to thank you for your support and interest in the Deep Transformation Podcast and the ongoing conversation in which we pursue the love of truth, the love of beauty, and the love of goodness, the eternal virtues and verities. If you've been touched and moved by this adventure and journey, we would ask you to press the like button and hit subscribe. It is deeply appreciated and enables us to grow and increase our ability to contribute. Thank you.
you had another really life changing and life orienting experience in Ramana Maharshi's cave, and quite a different quality from your earlier experience. Well,
Yeah, completely different. And segueing from what we were speaking about, if I clung to the reality of boundless love being the only reality, the only way that reality or God with a capital G or capital R could be experienced and known, then it might not have been possible for something else to appear and educate me. Well, there's a whole other universe. And so that happened. I kind of look at my life as BC before the cave and AC after the cave,
okay.
right? So, BC, I was an interfaith minister, and prayer and meditation was the central axis of my practice. But when I look back at that time, BC now, there was always a presumption that there were certain things in me that were impure that needed to get out, that needed to not be there. And I realized that after the cave, where it was just this being absorbed into such a depth that is non conceptual, that cannot be described, in which there is no one and no God and nothing. There's just nothing and no one, right? No self, not even a concept of a no self, no witness, just pure being in its thunderous, unshakable, silent depth. And that's now I understand, that's what, Ramana Maharshi's transmission really is. People ask me all the time, well, where can I read a book about Ramana? I said, well, you can read all the books you like, but that's not what it's about. Ramana's grace is Dakshinamurti, Shiva teaching in silence. It's transmission. And um, and so that transmission absorbed me. Um, and I don't know how long I was in the cave, really, in terms of time. But what I do know is that, the it set off in motion profound changes in that asked for a depth of surrender that was very total. And thankfully, there had been many years of practice and study and a spiritual musculature built up over the years that lends itself to a capacity to say yes, to just say, okay, even though it took everything, it took all things, all support structures. There was not one thing in my life, including my understanding of God and my prayer life, that it did not obliterate. That was the edgiest part. I couldn't pray anymore for a year. It was very awkward, because the experience was of, like, no words, no one to pray to anything at all. Um, all the spiritual concepts had been removed. And, this is for someone who's leading an interfaith seminary, training other people to be ministers. You can imagine of
Yeah, that's
being
difficult, right?
being that erased. And of course, it meant I had to let go of, that function and hand it on to others, because I could not put myself back into that square hole anymore. I was no longer a square peg. It wasn't possible. Um, yeah, so it's very deep, and then there was a big process of learning how to adapt to another level of intense vulnerability and openness. And my deepest yearning in all of that was how to function, how to be here in the world, how to navigate ordinary life without reconstructing an ego.
Mm.
I really didn't know, like, and I had big things to deal with, like how to navigate the US immigration system to get legal in America. As you know, Roger, that's not a simple matter, especially when you don't have a university doing that for you and you don't know anybody, which was my situation. Only you're hearing guidance. Come to the Bay Area, East North Bay, very clear. So a lot of very complex practicalities had to get handled, only I did not want to reconstellate as an ego self with all that stress and tension and insecurity and flapping around in order to navigate. So I learned a practice, and it was just three simple words. Okay, what now? What's needed now? And so this was nurtured by all my years of study in A Course in Miracles, which the text kind of leads us to make no decisions of yourself. Well, that actually is very practical, good advice, because your ego self only knows what it knows. It only knows how to navigate life from the paradigm of being a separate somebody who thinks it's in charge, who thinks that it has to contract in order to do everything, who thinks it's the thinker, who thinks it's the doer, in which there's inevitably insecurity, anxiety, and a bunch of stress. So I have been interested, well, is there a way to show up at my desk, right, to complex tasks with my students, in the kitchen with my husband when we're having a debate about something, right? As I'm watching the news, is there a way to show up in all of that in a different way, from a deeper place that I do know from experience? And that's my ongoing inquiry.
But in some sense, a teacher told me one time that you need an ego to catch the bus.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you have to do that. And we've been having a series of conversations with A.H. Almas, and in his teaching, he talks
Yes.
about ascending, to the mountain peak, to
Yeah.
the Holy Grail, if you will, the realization of that. And then a lot of people like to stay there because, who would want to go back to anything else? But then you have to do the descent. You
Yes.
have to bring it on back home, back into the world.
Absolutely. And I have a great, great blessing of being able to sit with and study with Hamid over the years. And that is a tremendous blessing and has helped me a great deal in the process of, this ongoing inquiry. And I remember, talking about the mountaintop, there was a time when, I was in Tiruvannamalai and I knew I wasn't yet ready to re-enter the world of the West and everything, and that I needed more time to steep there in that field of Ramana and the mountain. And I remember this arising, and it was like this spiritual fantasy. I could just happily disappear up this mountain, never to be seen again. Just live
Mm.
like just live like an ascetic, Part of me would have loved that. And I had a dream that night. And in the dream, it was as if the mountain itself, and by the way, this isn't an ordinary mountain, like this mountain has absorbed so much practice of such great souls over thousands of years, Ramana just being one of them. It was as if the mountain was shaking me and it kicked me up the backside and it says, get back into the world, lead a full human life and serve. And I left India the next day. It was like, that was the orders right there. There was no argument. Whatever you wanted, girl, tough luck. This is the truth. This is not what's supposed to be happening for you. Do not, this would be an avoidance
Yeah.
for me. It might not be for another soul, but it was not the Dharma that was supposed to be happening for me.
So you were called back
I was
into,
absolutely called back, yes. And so it was that was when I knew it was time to reemerge, to come back into the West. And that was when I was going, okay, what now? And big complex stuff like how to navigate a divorce, how to deal with all your possessions, wrap up a whole life, like transition from one continent to another and all the complexities, begin a whole new life where you don't know anyway, make friends, like build a new life, right? From ground zero.
yeah.
Big stuff. And okay, and the only way that that was possible was to stay in the now and to ask and listen, and then to be willing to be obedient to, okay, this. And so it wasn't like a voice saying, okay, do this. It would be just like the flow of life presenting the obvious next step of the thing that needed to be looked at, or the person that needed to be spoken to, or the research that needed to be done, or and also, the courage to open into it, even though it was vulnerable, even though it was edgy, just okay. And the strength and the courage actually comes from the depth of your devotion and your sincerity, really. Has for me anyway.
Say that again, the depth of your devotion and sincerity.
Yeah, that's where the strength comes from. That's where your courage comes from, right? When, you know, your deep heart is so engaged. It's like when you love someone very deeply, almost more than life itself. You naturally would do whatever it takes to help them thrive, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Right? Like a parent loves their child, and in that love there's action that happens in the service of their child's well-being, independent of whatever the parent. It takes them out of the self-centeredness and the worries and the concerns. You just do what's needed because there's something that you love more, that's more important, and it births itself. This is, by the way, the power, in my view, of devotion, and why, no matter what kind of path you're walking, it's not going to bring you all the way home without devotion.
Well, say more about that because that's quite a statement.
Yeah, it is. I believe it deeply. Well, it's because it's the source of the strength, the source of the love, the source of the motivation is God, right? And it's one and the same as love. And once we get a taste for it, it exponentiates itself. And so when you turn your consciousness into whatever your preferred name or face or form of the divine is, call it what you like, and you just let yourself say that name and you let yourself feel your love for that. The fact that you love that, it represents the truth that you love, that is the truth of us all, that is what really matters. It's like a flame getting stronger and building itself into a fire that transforms, you know, it's the fire that changes the shape of the metal, right? And not only that, but when we pour ourselves into devotional practices like certain prayers that have been said from through beings in countless forms and times and lineages, that we resonate with for whatever reason, or in my experience, when I turn into a mantra, every time when I've hit walls in my path or my journey or places of despair, what I've learned to do is turn into a mantra, which is not only a name of the divine, it's a vibration of holiness. It carries with it the love and the spiritual energy and devotion of countless beings before me. It's like this river that gathers momentum as it goes along and carries more souls back into itself. And then as soon as you intone Om Namah Shivaya or Om Mani Padme Hum or Om Namo Bhagavate or, you know, Our Father who art in heaven or may all beings dwell in the heart, whichever one does it for you, feels right for you, it's like there you are, you then get carried, you're entering this stream that has already been flowing, that's so much bigger than your worries and your concerns, so much bigger than your fear and your doubt. And it's this power in it, and it feeds our yes, and it empowers us, and it's like a strong broom that sweeps us. It's a strong broom of a substance that is purer than anything else, that is going to clean house. I could go on, but I'm starting to rave now.
Yes, you certainly could. I was going to ask you about this brings up something you said earlier about going to the cave, right? The holy cave. And Rupert Sheldrake, I don't know if you're familiar
I
with his work,
do,
but
yeah,
I'm very interested in science and physics and trying to figure out the whole thing. And he's a brilliant man, but he's also a very spiritual man, a mystic. And
definitely.
he talks about the power of pilgrimages,
Yes.
being these places. And I had experience one time while I was doing this tour of Europe, and I went to Dachau, right,
Uh-huh.
which is the Nazi concentration camp, and went there at night. And it was foggy and kind of misty and rainy, and they leave the gate open. There's nobody, taking tickets or anything. And I walked around there and just absorbed that suffering, and like your question as a 13-year-old, how, why, what the F over, you
Yeah.
know? And then we drove directly to Assisi.
Mm.
And
Gosh, wow. That's
and
amazing.
I know what a polarity, right?
But
And
perfect that you're like you something in you says, I want the full spectrum.
yes, indeed. And so we got there and it was all foggy. And I said, "Hey, Francis, could you give us some nice weather?" And all of a sudden the sun begins to lift. I'm like, okay, that's kind of scary. And we walked into the big cathedral there, and just it was in November. It was like a Holy Ghost town. There was barely anybody there. It was really beautiful. And there was a sign saying this tumba de Francesco, and it's like Francis's tomb. And I'm like, I am not ready for this. No. And I was just pulled down into this space. And there, it's hard for me to talk about without choking up. And there was his tomb, and all his brothers that I'd read about, people that were really loved him and that were together, were surrounding him in this circle. And it was just, I don't know, the light was perfectly holy. And I just sat there, and it felt like it felt like a holy fire was just burning my heart, you
Mm.
know, and I wasn't expecting it. I kind of had this idea, God is everywhere, da 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 da, it's like all this stuff, superstitions, and it just burned my heart away.
Yeah.
The pain, and so it makes me think that as a practice, going to these places where this energy has accumulated over
For
centuries,
sure.
decade, there's power, transformational power if we're open to it.
Very much. Yeah, and I think that's why human beings over times have flocked to these places where, a great soul has, let's just say, the window pane not only got so clarified, but the glass got taken out,
Yes.
right? And
Mm.
so there's just total openness for these celestial beauties and possibilities and this nobility, divine being to manifest itself in a human that
Yes.
has inspired us, and that the ripples of what poured through are still there and actually gather more momentum as more souls gather to say, we want this too, we want to feel this too.
Yeah.
And that's happened in many parts of the world. Um, and if we can take ourselves to these places, and I love it that you're including places where some of the most horrendous things have gone down, where the most awful, inhuman manifestations have gone, where the darkest things have happened too. And I know that there's something that's been going on in me in the last few years that I haven't been writing about but I will. It's coming soon, but I'll give you a little headline where I'm feeling this, you know, this polarity that isn't really two of all the suffering and distortion of all of the human condition that ever was, that has happened in me, that has happened in us all, that has happened in, Hitler, Jews, slave owners, slaves, rapists, the really the depth and density of the ignorance and the suffering that has gone down and is still going down. Can I open my whole being to all of it? Can it all be made love to in this vessel, right? Can I see and understand that for what it is? Can I open my heart to all of it and let the distortion and the suffering be transformed, be tonglened, be understood more completely?
Yeah.
And what can be birthed, in that possibility, of a deeper humanity, a deeper wisdom, a deeper compassion, a deeper possibility, new understandings and creativity of how we can show up and help others and be more beautiful and impeccable.
Yeah. And one of the other lessons I was given, or in Assisi, was there outside of the town. There's you just go down the hill and there's this church that Francis restored with his own hands, and later it became a place for Claire, his
Mm.
female counterpart, uh, lived and with her sisters, and eventually when he was ill he went there to die. So there's that kind of energy there, and it was just a chapel, and I just nobody there, and I just hung out and prayed. And I was starting to go back to the hill. What I kind of got was like Francis and Claire, his brothers and sisters, they had stepped up to the challenge of their times. What
Yeah,
was going on in the Middle Ages in Europe wasn't really a happy time.
not at
A
all.
time of slavery, serfdom, incessant wars, slaughter, rape, pillage, on and on. And he had found a way to meet the challenges of the historical time that he was in. And my mantra, my question, how can I step up to the challenges of my time? And what does that look like? And that, of course, that's still a question that I'm still working on.
And
Uh,
that is the question, isn't it? For all of us right now, and what are we called to personally? You know, what do we need to open our hearts to and be more fully present and meet so that, you know, we can be more responsive rather than reactive? We can hold down the light in what often seems like very dark times, where we can retain our optimism even though we have no idea what's happening next and how it's all going to shake down. Where we can be joyful and beautiful in spite of it all because we're in touch with something that is always here. A grace that is always so, and that life is still a blessing.
Yeah. And here's another question that you're here and you're on that I want to pose to you. I was at a small workshop with Andrew Harvey
Oh,
one
yeah.
time back east, and there was only like 12 of us in a living room. It was very intimate, and we got to hang out a lot. And he had, a list of reasons we should be concerned, right, about the state of the world, the state of things, humanity, whatever. And I can't remember them, but I don't think they've changed much over the years. But the last thing he said, the reason for hope, he said, and this has stuck with me, he said, God has an agenda. What do you say to that statement?
I agree completely.
Okay.
I don't claim to know what that agenda is.
Yeah. Okay.
Only the little whiff that I glean, I would summarize as wake up and love.
Mm. Mhm.
That covers, yeah, I think that covers it. It's beautiful.
And if we just let that reverberate through, and let it enter and go, okay, where am I blind? Where am I asleep? Where am I less than awake? What actually takes me away from being open-hearted and awake in this now? So if we were to let that help us to take inventory, right? It is something that I do on a regular basis. Before I'm going into any retreat, I ask myself this question: is there anything that is taking me away in any tiny little minute or big way from being open-hearted and awake in the now, for my impact to be anything less than a blessing? And I write a list. This is my taking inventory. And it's a fearless inventory,
That's
right? But my commitment is whatever goes down on that piece of paper, on that intimate, I'm going to be loving. I'm going to be kind to myself because I need that kindness and that forgiveness in advance for my own human stumblings, the places where my awakening may not be total or complete or fully integrated or fully embodied. I need forgiveness and grace in the looking so that I can look.
yeah.
It's not so that I can just say, oh, there, there. No, it's so you can look. You can be fierce where you need to be, because we all need to be. It's like
Uh,
the tree of life says, we need the mercy and the need to justice. We need the both.
Yes.
That's a beautiful question to ask before, well, almost any activity. I wrote that down, and the words I took were, is there anything in the way of my showing up, being loving, and being fully helpful? It's a beautiful koan for life.
Yeah, well, it's a way just to take inventory and see, where am I? And then there's a commitment to see, okay, so how do we embrace where we are honestly with loving kindness and compassion and mercy, and then practice into those places? Is one of the things I see in all my years of working with people is that, we all tend to apply our practice in the places where it feels good. And we often don't apply our practice in the places that where we most need to. And this is a curious phenomena that, we all have blind spots and things, places where we don't look. And I'm sure, the people who hang around with me can say, yeah, Miranda's not looking at that and that and that. She should look at look. So it's also good. Well, if you have good friends who know you, might be useful to ask them once in a while, when you know and trust that they only have your good intent at heart, is there anything you see me getting up to, you know, that seems to be taking away from me being as fully awake and open hearted in the now as possible? Anything that's a bit of a drag for you to have to deal with that's coming out of me?
Yeah.
Would we dare to ask the ones we love that question?
Well, and you're pointing to the beauty of a spiritual community, the friends that one can,
Spiritual friendship.
yeah, spiritual friendship with people on the path, sharing the values of awakening and loving and growing up, and supporting one another in it.
And I think that's so important. And I think it's more important than ever before because if we just look at our culture, just in the last 20 years, you know, all the technology that we're all using is forcing us all to multitask more than we ever have, more than is biologically good for our well-being on every level. There's all the neuroscience. You probably know more about it than I do, Roger, about what multitasking does and how it diminishes our quality of functioning on so many levels. Right? This is not actually natural. We're not yet adapted to it. And for spiritual practice, that's a disaster. All the great wisdom traditions have said we need to develop one pointed concentration. Well, we're all becoming ADHD because of the bouncing around that we're just operating out of, that isn't good for us. So we're up against that. We're up against social media, misinformation, being bombarded by so much. Everyone I know gets more emails than they can handle. And so some people stop using email and just text one another now. And that's come way out of control. And so this bombardment and lack of space that makes it harder to stay intimately in touch with what's really going on, with where we are, where we're abiding. So I think we need community, we need one another, we need the cultivation of that kind of spiritual friendship to support one another in our practice as much as possible.
Yeah, and you're emphasizing now the several things. One, just the value of spiritual friends, or of people sharing those values of waking up and growing and loving, etc. And you're also speaking to the overly busyness of our life, and I'm struck by the issues you're describing here of our hyperactive ADHD lifestyles these days, and the transmission you got in Ramana Maharshi's cave. And perhaps you can share that because it was a pretty almost the opposite.
Yeah, be nothing, do nothing, get nothing, become nothing, seek for nothing, relinquish nothing, be as you are, rest in God.
Mm. Oof. I can feel the letting go that induces. Um, yeah.
So it's how I understand that now, it's simultaneously just a beautiful, just like unhooking, an unhooking of all the mechanisms of ego consciousness, separate somebodyness that misunderstands everything and is interfering with the divine circuitry, and inviting the simple rest in in God, where everything is restored and restored, resets us to our original factory default setting. And I use that myself. When I notice there's tension, contraction, where there's a reconstellation into an ego mechanism in order to respond, tackle something, you know, sometimes I just lie on my carpet in my office here and I just come back to be nothing, do nothing, get nothing. And it's just like, oh, thank you. But I also understand it's an ongoing practice. It's the practice of what I call ego relaxation, relaxing the mechanism that thinks it's the doer. It's an overdeveloped muscle we all have. Relaxing the energy within our ego that thinks it has to get, the grasping, I need to get this, I need to get there, I need to get that, the becoming. There's someone who thinks it needs to become something in order for something to happen, right? Or seek for something, or it has to have a goal, or has to have some outward motion, or it has to get rid of something that it believes should, all this innocent misunderstanding of our separate somebodyness. Come on, darling, let's just come back down to reality, shall we? So let's settle down into the deeper truth, which is, no, we are all within and part of God, always, even when that's not our felt reality, that's still what's so, but it's where we get to be restored to a deeper, purer platform from which we can open our eyes into the ordinary and see what can emerge rather than tense up and stress and struggle and push, headbutt into life.
And this is such a different perspective from conventional understanding, and certainly from my own upbringing and understanding, which had no knowledge of the possibility of letting go, or trusting in grace. That it was all about, and our conventional training is all about, refining motivation, honing the ego, honing one's separate self sense, and the emphasis on becoming an effective agent in the world. So this is a very, very different perspective and understanding of human nature and possibilities.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, it's definitely the flip opposite of
Yeah.
everything, conventional, worldly, would say try harder, do more, become more, effort more, get rid of the things that aren't right. It's a complete flip. And it reminds me of, I don't know whether it was Gurdjieff or someone else who said that, usually when we turn a commonly accepted worldly idea 180 degrees on its head, we usually land closer to the truth.
Mm.
And so it is very much a koan in the way of the Zen tradition. And who knows whether, the great being that taught me Zen meditation in my 20s, Sister Eileen McKinns, had primed that pump. But also, A Course in Miracles had primed that pump. I woke this morning with a memory, something I'd forgotten about, but I want to share it with you, and probably because you're a Course in Miracles student, Roger, that I was starting to really dig into working with the Course in Miracles in my early 20s. And I remember the first time I went through the workbook, and there is a lesson in the workbook that says, I rest in God.
Ah, yes.
Right. And it's just beautiful. And I mean, if you read the actual text of that lesson, it is pure poetry. It is saying things that are just like medicine upon a soul. It's saying, every time you rest in God, a tired mind is suddenly made glad. The bird begins to sing again. The stream long dry begins to flow. The path opens up, and you find you walk the path, and it just becomes lighter and easier. Every time you rest in God for everyone, you know. And it's just so beautiful and poetic and true. But I remember, okay, I would always do the lesson first thing in the morning, and then I would try and be a good little Course in Miracles student. And, often, A Course in Miracles asks you, okay, 3 times today or on the hour, come back to this. And inevitably, I mean, it's very humbling because you just completely forget. And I remember driving with my first husband down the freeway in England. We were going to visit his mother. It's a 2-hour drive. And he and I are talking, what's the lesson again? We'd both forgotten. And, we're back and forthing, and we'd come to the conclusion it was something about rest and something about God. But we couldn't for the life of ourselves remember. And we were joking around going, oh, God's having a rest. Where's the rest of God? I'm exhausted. I need a rest. We're playing around, screaming with laughter. And then finally, we're almost pulling into her driveway. And we looked at each other and said, I rest in God. It took us 2 hours to remember something so exquisite, pure, direct, and utterly simple. And it was so wonderful. It was such a powerful, positive confrontation of how come I couldn't remember that? It really helped me look at my resistance, and it also made me want to cultivate the will, the willingness. So this is part of what you talk about, Roger, about, yes, we do need to, there is a part we have to play in the showing up for a practice that requires, you know, getting to it, remembering it, applying it, coming back to it, sticking with it, even when we don't feel like it, understanding what's going on in our resistance and not letting our resistance just win. So from that day onwards, I took to writing the Course in Miracles lesson on my wrist. And even though, as the day wore on, it would get harder and harder to read. Nevertheless, it was the action of I'm writing this on my hand because I want to remember. I want to remember this 2 minutes on the hour where I marinate back in this reality, this invitation. Um, I really look back with a tremendous affection and gratitude on that time and on the arising of that willingness in me, that I'm sure primed the pump, for further realizations and things.
And there's that paradox of that how we figure this out. It's a polarity, but being, resting in God, and then becoming
Yeah,
God wants us to be.
that's right.
That therein lies the alchemy or the rub or the mystery or what it means to be human.
Absolutely. And, the mystery of, when we see it, well, I feel that when I look at these Tibetan Yobyong paintings of everything and nothing making love to itself, being and becoming, um, emptiness, fullness, our part, the mysteries part is this divine dance. Um, but here we are. I mean, right now, here we are, all of us sort of in our own way, dedicated to our own practice, our own path, the ongoing process of learning what's meaningful and how to be the most pure, noble human being we can be in ways that are beneficial and beautiful and joyful.
Yeah. Um, there's grace has been so central to your understanding of life, your teaching, your way of being. Um, and I'm struck by that it's part of a whole understanding of reality for you, that the divine, the Tao, whatever you want to call it, is beneficent in some way. And you've decided your answer to Einstein's question, is the universe beneficent, is yes. uh,
Totally. More than yes. Yeah.
uh, and I contrast that, this is very intriguing and helpful for me because coming from the other side of things, which was a very scientific, reductionist, materialist, all this spiritual stuff is nonsense beginning, which still leaves its impact. And
Mm.
I'm repetitively humbled by the extent to which the worldview I grew up in still leaves its marks and
Ah.
uh, leaves me approaching, much more inclined towards the active rather than the receptive side of life and
Mm.
practice, even to times it's dysfunctional. I just had a really nasty case of COVID, and during the midst of that, found myself when I had no energy and no anything, still trying to push in some way to keep a practice going. And it would have been the perfect time, perfect, just to say, I can't do it. Over to you. And to rely on grace. But did I think of that until, a week or so, a couple of weeks later? No. So it's like, wow, after all these years, that attitude, that worldview, still has tentacles. And in some ways we're mirror images. You very early
Yeah.
were opened into that perspective, and it became your foundational worldview. And for me, it feels like you're a grace native. I'm a grace immigrant. I feel like digital natives, digital immigrants. So I don't know what to, welcome your response to that, but it's very, for me, very intriguing and wonderful and graceful to have you as an exemplar of that, and to be able to dialogue with you about it, and to see a beautiful mirror image for myself.
Well, I think what you're speaking of, and I feel very touched by what you're sharing, Roger, and there's a few things. The first one is that grace, the mystery of the divine force in that always brings forth what is needed in its beneficence. If healing is needed, it brings the compassion that is what's needed for healing. If strength is needed, it brings that forth. If courage is needed, it brings that forth. If, you know, that's my experience. But the gate is always humility and surrender.
Yeah.
And so the mind must humble itself. There's no other way, and what helps me is really getting honest with, the limits of my mind, and what we were sharing together, all of us, a moment ago about, recognizing what we don't know. All of us, and I'm sure everyone listening, has learned some truths about life and humanity and being here and the divine. And it, the humility I'm speaking of doesn't trash that, but it's really rather a posture, an inner attitude that we can cultivate, that I find what helps me get into that is when I contemplate the questions, you know, what what is the cause of the love that I feel for the people I feel it for? Right? Who and what brought those beings that I can't imagine my life not including? The privilege of what we've been able to share in together so far. Who made that happen? Was it our effort that made that happen?
Yeah.
Was it our effort that made us interested to explore the spiritual path as messily and imperfectly as we might be doing? Like, how is it that you were built the way you were built, with this extraordinary mind and capacity to synthesize that I really admire? And who and what made me the way this vessel is built, with a different kind of openness and with weaknesses too? So when we really contemplate what is so, the most beautiful things in our life, the truest, purest parts of our experience, and we go deeper into it, what is the source of that? Who and what made that happen? There's a natural humility of the mind into its rightful reverential place, where we realize there is something so much more intelligent than we can even fathom that is what's in charge and has been this whole time, and has been curating itself in us and inviting us to learn certain things and develop in certain ways and stumble and have the experiences so that we can learn more. And it is grace that's doing that. It's the grace of what Aurobindo calls the divine force. And I love how he said, surrender, the kind of full surrender that all the paths are trying to lead us and help us with. He said, surrender doesn't happen in a day. He said, the mind resists and clings to its ideas. So sincere effort with your practice is required. He said, but if this is done, the rest comes by grace of the divine force.
Hmm.
Yeah, let me say a little bit about Roger, if you don't mind. I think Roger's a 3 on the Enneagram,
Oh, yeah?
and he became an MD, a psychiatrist, and while he was in med school, he got a PhD in theoretical biology, Roger, something like that. And all these accomplishments, written all these great books, and met and hung out with all these people. Yet he's one of the humblest men I've ever met. I've ever
Yeah,
had the grace to be friends with.
right.
And that drivenness to accomplish has made him now able to influence for the good, or be a channel for peace, or be a channel for love. Then if there hadn't been that force in him to drive him to get that knowledge and get those letters in front of his name and all that, that in itself is also grace.
Totally. As
Yeah.
you know, and one of the things I'd love to just share publicly here is that, I first encountered you, Roger, when I was a young Course in Miracles student in my early 20s. And I happened to be just part of a small team of people that were gathering other Course in Miracles students together to form community. It ended up becoming something called the Miracle Network in the UK. It's still going today. And we were all young, enthusiastic students of the course. And, someone had found an article you'd written, and it was a really wonderful article. And we all had this big debate about it over dinner one night. And then we decided, let's publish this. And it was your article on looking at A Course in Miracles through the lens of the 4 primary yogas of Hinduism. And I loved it. I'm in interfaith seminary training at the time. And so this totally rocked my world because, I so appreciate your interest and capacity to sort of see things and connect the dots and understand with these mystical systems fit and dovetail and where they don't. And I was reading your and Francis's books, where you were bringing forth your favorite passages of the Course in Miracles and making that available for people. So, I mean, how beautiful is that? You know?
Yeah. Well, one could even say it was grace.
My point precisely. And so that grace moves through us. We are ultimately, this being human, is a grace delivery device. Our bodies, our hearts, our
Oh, I like
minds.
that phrase. That's
This is
nice.
what I call the 4th dimension of grace, which is the embodiment of grace, the living of it. And when we regard the beingness that we are with all of its various faculties, strengths and weaknesses, you know, as a vessel. It's a vessel for the divine to express and pour more of itself into this world in a unique way.
Mm,
We're not supposed to be the same.
yeah,
We're supposed to ignite one another.
yeah, yeah, beautifully said. What a wonderful, ecstatic vision, actually, of the grace delivery devices.
Yeah, I
It-
write about this in my book,
yeah,
In the
you
Way of
do.
Grace, because,
You do.
and there's a
Yes.
chapter for anyone who's interested, in as
Uh,
we're, it's in the structure of the book is in 4 chunks, and each of the chunk represents teachings and practices and perspectives that relate to open up grace in a different kind of experience of what grace is and how we become more graceful. And where it's all leading is to becoming grace delivery devices, which is the embodiment of grace, the 4th
yeah,
dimension, being the grace.
yeah,
You see, grace is a divine force, it's alive. So maybe I should have this conversation with Hamid one day, but I think maybe from the diamond approach perspective, It would be somewhat akin to, what he calls the dynamism, the unfolding dynamism of reality. It's alive, dynamic, pulsating, living, continuing, expressing through us.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I think in the early Christian writings in the New Testament, it was the Holy Spirit.
Exactly. That's
It said
right.
said it was a teacher, uh, a comforter, uh, you know, the active part of expression of God. That
Exactly. The spirit of holiness.
yeah,
Yeah. And it's alive.
yeah,
Beautiful.
yeah. And I want to just mention more about your book, Miranda, because it really is a beautiful piece of work, The Way of Grace, the Transforming Power of Ego Relaxation. And it really does give a beautiful distillation of all the thinking and about and grace you've received, and the way you've just given a very beautiful expression of opening to this way of being and surrendering. And it's just to, just to acknowledge what a nice, a very beautiful work it is.
Thank you.
Uh, Whereas there's so much more we could we could get into. We haven't even covered some of the things I was thinking we'd get to, but
Well, maybe we do a third podcast
there
sometime.
you go. Probably down the
that
line for
that
sure.
would be grace. Yeah,
That
thank
would be
you.
great. Yes, that would be beautiful. As we come towards the end here, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, goodness. Just what's arising right now is just the importance of yes and thank you, which is a practice actually of being here now in all of it, the beauty and the horror, the uncertainty, our hopes, our concerns, our love, our caring, our despair, um, our inspiration, and just opening to all of the mystery and the grace inherent to all parts of our experience, and remembering it's all a gift. Just like I'm sure you've had the experience as I have had, where you're with someone who you love and cherish, and they're dying, they're leaving this world. And in that moment where you intuitively know this is the last communication in this life, in this form. If you've ever felt that, as I have, isn't what comes out of you just gratitude? Just a desire to say, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you for it all, including the messy things, the arguments, the, the difficult spots, as well as the beauty and the joy and the laughter and the fun. And if we can just stay close to that, just yes to life and thank you. Maybe it could even become a practice as we walk in nature. Yes on the in breath. Thank you on the out breath.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just add that my late wife, one of the last, just very shortly before she died, someone asked what her spiritual practice was, and she said, "I'm practicing gratitude." So, okay, that's been a useful one. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, deep gratitude to you, Miranda, both for being with us today, but also for opening to it all as you have over your lifetime. And it's been a very remarkable lifetime. You have imbibed the world's wisdom, you've transmitted it, you've shared so much of what you've learned. You have been a wonderful vehicle of grace. And just it's a delight to have you here, and it's a delight to know you. So, as you said, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Roger. And thank you, Heidi, and those who are listening. And I just hope this has been meaningful and helpful and a good friend to you on your road.
Thank you.